I'm Joe Glenton, and welcome back to Warrior Nation, the only podcast offering a critical lens on militarism in the UK. In this, our fifth series, we'll be speaking to anti-militarists around the world to explore their unique motivations, tactics, and approaches. Their expertise includes everything from opposing the arms trade and militarised borders to countering military recruiting and supporting war resistors. With UK government support for continuing wars in Ukraine and elsewhere, and now the bombing of Gaza, platforming and enabling anti-militarist discourse is vital. It follows that these conversations are more important than ever. If you enjoy what we produce and would like to support us to make more of it, then you can help us keep making Warrior Nation for as little as £2 a month via our Patreon, or you can support us through our donation page. And if you'd like to keep up to date with our work, you can sign up for our free monthly newsletter. Kathy Kelly is an American peace activist and author, a key member of organisations like Voices in the Wilderness and Voices for Creative Nonviolence. As part of peace team work in several countries, she travelled to Iraq 26 times, notably remaining in combat zones during the early days of both US-Iraq wars. From 2009 to 2019, her activism and writing focused on Afghanistan, Yemen and Gaza, along with domestic protests against US drone policy. She has been arrested more than 60 times at home and abroad, and written of her experiences among targets of US military bombardment and inmates of US prisons. Kathy Kelly, a giant figure of the anti-war and anti-militarist movement in the US, obviously, but here in the UK, I followed your work. Many of my colleagues have followed your work for many years, and we're great admirers. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, Joe, I'm so pleased to know you've got this podcast and that you're in your fifth season. That's wonderful.
Thank you. I just wanted to frame the podcast a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you're doing now, maybe a little bit about your background, how you found your way into anti-militarism, and just give us some of the context. How did you find your way here?
You know, Joe, when I was much younger, it always seemed to me wrongful that soldiers would be required to possibly be killed or possibly kill someone else, come back maimed or tortured or psychologically unable to cope. All these terrible things could be demanded of a soldier, and what would we demand of the peace people? And it seemed to me that it would be a good idea to raise the level of risk that we were willing to take, but also to ask ourselves, what about courage for peace, not for war? What about ways in which we could reform, in a sense, how people sense their security being achieved? Because what really threatens people in our world today? I think the greatest threats we face right now are threats about what we're doing to our own environment, threats of nuclear weapon proliferation, threats of new pandemics. And really, militarism isn't all that relevant to solving those problems. In fact, it undermines solutions because we keep on having to develop this idea of terrible enemies that we have to spend all of our resources on being able to defeat by building more and more weapons and larger arsenals. So I think in many ways there's a certain appeal of rationalism that has drawn me over the years. And in a way, it's also, I think, faith-based in the sense that the major religion in the United States today is militarism.
Mm-hmm.
That's the dominant religion. And I want to say, no, my faith isn't based in militarism. My faith is based in people sharing resources and extending hands of friendship and, building community. So there's a bit of a stubbornness that combines with rationalism and also a great appreciation for the opportunities to, how can I put it, rub shoulders with some of the finest people in the world. And that I've certainly been able to do. What a gift, huh?
Absolutely. I wonder if there are all kinds of arguments flung around about I guess, kind of academic arguments, US imperial decline, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems clear that the US militarily, what it still has, is gigantic military power. We've emerged from wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, though they are ongoing. I wouldn't want to say they're just a part of history. And we see the US involved. We see the amount of US bases and US military influence around the world. We see the US centrally involved in what's going on in Gaza and Ukraine in terms of aid and other kinds of support. Speaking as you are from the US, could you give us your assessment of this moment, this historical moment where we're at, in terms of militarism, of course, but also the struggle against militarism and against war?
Well, Joe, at this particular moment, I think our hearts have to ache for the people in Gaza. 30,000 killed. It could be as many as 80,000 children starving to death, being starved to death. It's a hideous reality. And I know that we can't really find actions commensurate to the crimes being committed. So I want to be very careful in saying that, in a way, we may be at a portal. We may see a bit of a tipping point that I've never seen before in my life. Uh, I was deeply distressed by the United States plans to go to war against Iraq. And, the Guinness Book of Records said that the world had come closer than ever before to stopping a war before it started because there was such massive demonstrations, but then they all went quiet.
Mhm.
It ended. The war started, and you couldn't find that vigorous level of protest. But this is different. The protests are worldwide. The United States and its massive military seems to be increasingly isolated. Israel is isolated. These shameful vetoes that the United States has put forth 3 times within the United Nations Security Council because it refuses to call for a ceasefire has brought about a reaction around the world, and it's firm and rooted, and it's building alliances. I mean, you're now seeing al-Haq in Palestine, linked up with the campaign against the arms trade in the UK. All of these different alliances that we haven't seen before that can bring to bear on this situation legal institutions along with massive popular uprisings. So I think we may be at a point where militarists might have to say, this isn't just rhetoric. There could be real consequences. I hope that's the case.
Definitely. I wonder if we could just spend a little bit of time talking about some of your current work, in particular the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. I wonder if you could explain to our listeners what's going on with that campaign, and where it's at currently.
Well, Joe, could I just say that following World War I, there were 60,000 university students across the United States who had taken an oath saying they would never, ever get involved in a foreign war. The title Merchants of Death was the title of a book which had so influenced U.S. elected officials that a senator, Senator Nye, NYE, held 100 hearings to investigate whether these major companies that had pulled the United States and other countries into World War I could be accused of wrongdoing, of criminal wrongdoing. And what happened to that? Very widespread desire to say war is criminal, war should be outlawed. Well, the weapon makers and the bankers came back with a vengeance, and they threatened elected officials, and they made sure that those people knew, if you undermine our capacity to keep profiting from ongoing wars, you can kiss your elected officialdom goodbye. And they learned how to more or less purchase elected officials like they were their flunkies. And so that process went on and on. President Dwight D. Eisenhower presided over the buildup of the largest arsenal in world history. But he warned, beware of the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex.
Mhm.
And we've certainly seen that. So we thought, well, certainly governments are to be held accountable for um, wars of choice and all of the carnage and bloodshed and destruction they've caused. But what about the war profiteers, the companies? What if they're held accountable? So we decided that for the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal, we would focus on four major companies: Raytheon, now renamed um, Rex, and Lockheed Martin, and Boeing, and a major manufacturer of weaponized drones called General Atomics. So we're focusing on those four companies, and completely online, we're releasing weekly episodes that are a half hour long, and there are judges all around the world. We have Dr. Salah Ibrahim in the UK and Arwa Muqdad from Yemen, people who have themselves been affected by these wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Lebanon. And they're the judges, but also people are watching these videos. When we had one with an interview with John Pilger, I believe there were at least 1,500 viewers. The range of viewing varies, but this will be an archived tribunal, which people can use in different ways in the future as well. But what we most want to see as an outcome is ordinary, average people beginning to take very seriously the idea of boycott, of divestment, of isolating these companies and saying there are consequences, legal consequences potentially, for what you are doing. We want to have this be an ongoing campaign, and we've been very grateful for the participation and guidance of all of the groups involved so far.
Definitely. I think there's an interesting question emerging there. To me, you talk about the degree of resistance in those earlier, 100 years ago or so that you're talking about, and you can look around, and there is resistance. There were the big marches against the Iraq War, huge marches in this country and all around the world for Palestine and so on. And I wanted to draw in a point you made earlier. Do you think this idea of militarism as a religion, do you think that is what's held that back? Do you think that is what has kept resistance as a lower level, almost like a cultural aspect of militarism? And it's very close to my heart because I see here, and I see in the US from US veterans as well, this kind of worship of war, the elevation of the veteran, the lionization of war. Do you think that that's a part of why resistance happens on maybe a lesser scale since the big outburst of resistance in the First World War?
Well, certainly the glamorizing of military might, the glamorizing of the soldier's role, the idea that you have to thank the soldier for their service
Mhm.
because they've made these sacrifices. But, on the other hand, here in the United States, the average has been 22 combat veterans take their lives. The idea that um, the mainstream media could be purchased has certainly, given the large coffers, been plausible. It hasn't been difficult, I don't think, for militarists to say, well, we can get airtime, we can create movies, we can create celebrities. But increasingly younger people aren't necessarily so tuned in to mainstream media. And so this is an unusual opportunity, I believe, where the brainwashing has somewhat stopped. It doesn't work quite as well if people don't consume the mainstream media and they make their own media. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a whole lot of room for misinformation, but especially right now where we're seeing alliances between uh, people of color, the uh, hideous ongoing killing and slaughter in Gaza, causing many new alliances. Jewish Voice for Peace allying with the Black Lives Matter movement. We're seeing shifting alliances, and I think the the role, for instance, of Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the world, a place that's already been uh, battered badly by Saudi bombing, by the destruction of their infrastructure and their healthcare. The Yemenis are turning out in the millions every weekend. And, they're saying, look, we're going to attack the ships and the routes in order to stand up for people in Gaza and to say, open up a humanitarian corridor there. And so I think we're seeing, even within Yemen, shifting alliances such that people who are at the Houthis' throats saying, we will never co-govern with you, or saying, well, actually, we'll be defecting from the ranks that we were part of because we see that we can't any longer abandon the Palestinians. So what I want to say is that all bets are off to a certain extent about what's going to happen in the future, but it's a very um, fertile time for, I think, resistance to grow at a rate that we had never seen before. Even war tax refusal.
Mm.
I haven't paid a dime of income tax to the United States government since 1980, but I always thought, well, that's not something I'd even recommend to most people. But it's going upward as people are seriously questioning, where do I want my resources to go?
Absolutely. I think that's a very important point. I'd like to stay with it for a moment because fundamentally the theme of this series is strategy and tactics. You've told me there's been a spike since directly related to Gaza. There's been a spike in interest in pursuing war tax refusal. Can you talk to me a little bit about is that a campaign? Is that what's going on there exactly? Is there is it younger people that we were just talking about? Younger people are maybe more anti-war. I mean, what's the story there?
Well, there has been certainly for many decades a U.S. group called the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, and there's been plenty of advice about ways to do it: lower your salary beneath the taxable income, or find um, a, a a trade that you can engage in where you're more or less paid under the table. There have been ways in which people have been able to live their lives and live happily and live in community and not pay the federal income tax. So it's not true to say, there are two things that are inevitable: death and taxes. But it hasn't been a popular movement. However, of late, this new track group, the War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, says they've had a big increase in questions. How do you do this? What are the practicalities involved? And that's a good thing if people are beginning to question, where are my resources going? How is the military raising all of this money to wage wars? And why is it that our infrastructure is crumbling, that we go into debt just trying to get an education? Our health care is so extraordinarily expensive in the United States. So
Yes.
so those are good questions to see people promoting.
Definitely. Do you think? I mean, I'd like to hear your view on it. My sense here in the last few days, I don't know if you've been tuned into it. There was a series of motions put in Parliament and a huge row. Members of Parliament walked out about a ceasefire. But I mean, we have a Tory government, but I sense there's something similar in the US with a liberal, a democratic government. There's a sense that what's going on in Gaza is causing a kind of political crisis in the ruling class, whether it's the generals, the politicians, the top of the media. Is that your sense as well? Or am I being a little bit too optimistic there?
Well, I think the Democrats are quite nervous that if Biden sticks with his unwavering support for Israel, he could lose the election. He could go down along with Netanyahu.
Hmm.
So, yes, it does seem that the persistence and the ethical groundedness of what people are saying with regard to Israel is not going to go away, in part because Israel every day is causing more starvation, more disease, more apartheid ethnic cleansing, and more evidence of genocide. So for any governing person to say, well, I'm going to stick with Netanyahu and people who are increasingly sounding as though they are as deplorable as the Nazis.
Mhm.
It doesn't, it doesn't really. make much sense, I wouldn't think, for somebody who's serious about a future when people have memories. And, in 2026, when elections come about in the United States for congressional seats, I think the young people will be out and ready to vote, and they'll have a long memory of the kinds of statements and choices that the elected officials in the Democratic Party have made lately. I
Certainly.
mean, 3 senators, only
Mm.
3 senators, voted against a continued military supplies being shipped to Israel. That's an incredibly low number and shows the spinelessness, but it also emphasizes that the American Israeli Political Action Committee, AIPAC, has had a tremendous vice-like grip over those senators. Now, can they don't have the votes. They've got the money, but they don't necessarily have the votes.
Mhm.
And this is what I think young people are going to be pressing forward with.
If you enjoy what we produce and would like to support us to make more of it, then you can help us keep making Warrior Nation for as little as £2 a month via our Patreon, or you can support us through our donation page. And if you'd like to keep up to date with our work, you can sign up for our free monthly newsletter. See the show notes for more details. Yeah, I noticed something very strange this week where the little heir to the throne, Prince William, came out for a ceasefire, and it's a bizarre conjunction of things that on Palestine it seems that, and I don't think he's a man of the left, but the heir to the throne, that a literal prince is kind of on Palestine, pitching left of the Democrats and even Labour in this country. To me, I don't know what you think about it, but it seems to me there's a bizarre conjunction. As you say, there's a suggestion of a portal, of a kind of crunch moment. Very strange things are happening in international politics, particularly in Western democracies at the moment. Do you agree with that?
Well, yes, and I think that it was, possible to say, "Oh, well, look, isn't this great? Members of the royal family have been in the military,"
Yeah.
and but the quote that sat with me this morning from Prince William was, quote, "Too many people have been killed." Well, maybe we could start asking ourselves, how can we learn to live together without killing one another? And, too many people have been killed. One person being killed, one child being slaughtered is like a barbaric practice of child sacrifice. You should never, ever hold children accountable for the actions of any kind of governing or ruling group or fighting group. The children are not responsible, and to slaughter children is it's barbaric. So, when you think about the International Court of Justice and the ways in which people are saying, look, a ruling has been given, at least enforce the ruling. They didn't say that the ceasefire must be put in place and that the offensive is wrong, but they've at least said that you can't continue to prevent humanitarian aid from going forward. So, the heartlessness of continuing to undermine the possibility of people being fed in Gaza is certainly going to be more and more clear. I mean, look how they came out against UNRWA. The United Nations Relief and Works Association is the only way, with some infrastructure, some heft to get food and fuel and water and medicine to people, and how quickly, on unfounded charges, uh, countries like the US and the UK said, okay, we're going to withdraw our funding. We're going to undermine that group. Who is that serving? Why?
Mhm.
Why are they so frightened of I think, the money that the Israeli lobby is able to wield and threaten people that they'll lose a lot of money if they don't go along with very evil policies.
Certainly, it was a very strange moment, wasn't it, when aid was withdrawn on charges which, I mean, like if charges are made, you're willing to hear the evidence, but I don't think any's been presented so far. But it was a very strange moment. because it followed so closely immediately on the heels of the ICJ ruling. But to talk about, I think we're probably both on the same page that we see change coming from below, change coming from below. But do you get a sense that these big international institutions like the ICJ, the ICC, the UN, is there a sense that their limits have really been exposed, particularly over Gaza? It's probably not news to you because I mean, you've been around this stuff for a long time, but is there a sense that they've been like particularly exposed, that the kind of limitations of these institutions, which are supposed to enforce the law, make rulings, and so on and so on?
I think you're right. We have to be realistic that there are limits. I guess the question is, when does it shift from uh, rhetoric to actual costs and consequences?
Mhm.
And that's why I think the boycott and divestment strategies can become very, very important, because there could be consequences if let's think for a moment about the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I know each of the nuclear weapon bearing countries have just, laughed at that treaty, walked away from it. They don't even discuss it. But take, for instance, Ireland. Uh, there's a lot of traffic that goes through Shannon Airport every day. And Ireland is now a signatory to that treaty. By law, if Ireland discovers that anything's going through Shannon Airport that is being used for the development, storage, sale, or possible use of nuclear weapons, then that's against the law. People can go after the Irish government and the United States government, which uses Shannon Airport every day, and say, sorry, there's a law here that's being violated. It's almost a little bit like a chess game. The more and more you can put in place, I think, these blockages so that the militarists can't so easily have their way, and also at the same time be saying, look, we need those bases. We need that manufacturing capacity. We need that ingenuity and scientific know how to solve the great problems we face. So pull in the environmentalists and all of the passion to try to prevent ecological collapse. If we can pull in many, many, many more of the academics and ask them, those who are tenured, to take a risk, for goodness sakes. What risk would they face if they started to tell the truth about the ways in which the militarists have uh, put their tentacles into the academic institutions, and call them out and speak up and speak truth about the power
Mhm.
that's been so unfairly manipulated to support war making?
Absolutely. An argument I often make as someone who served in I use the term served loosely. It's questionable what precisely I served, but who was in Afghanistan. And the argument I often make, and I'd like to hear your view on it, and it's particularly relevant also with Gaza, the technologies of war developed. And Gaza, some people talk about it as a laboratory of surveillance, of drones, and so on. So on. I repeatedly state that, and I remember there was a very clear moment during the BLM protests, military armored vehicles leased to the US police coming out. I suppose my point is those technologies developed for war come home. They come home, and you can't be indifferent just because you're comfortable and white and Western, or however you'd like to frame it. Those things will return, come home to roost, as it were, and they will be wielded against populations in the future when climate change starts to bite deeper and deeper, borders become more militarized and securitized. Do you recognize that characterization? Because that's when I look at my experiences in Afghanistan and the experiences of the technologies, I'm kind of thinking what's coming down the pike, what's coming down the way when those technologies are brought to bear on populations at home.
Well, certainly with regard to drone proliferation, for instance, I think that uh, the subjection to surveillance, but also to the availability of weaponized drones,
Mhm.
and not only to militaries but to non-state actors, if you will. To how long will it be before street gangs are using weaponized drones and quadricopter drones, and that technology will only spread? Um, I think that to some extent, people in the United States have been bizarrely secure.
Mhm.
You know, we've got an ocean on either side of our country. We've got Canada and Mexico to the north and to the south. You know, we aren't threatened by any country that could invade us. And yet people in the United States are being told all the time, "Be afraid, be very afraid, be afraid of China, be afraid of Russia." You know, to me, the pandemic was very illustrative of how important it is to form alliances, share scientific know-how and research, and collaborate because another pandemic could come around the corner. And what we needed was collaboration with China and not enmity and accusation and acrimony. So, you know, this idea that our security is going to be founded in having greater and greater weapons systems, it's I think it's so untrue in face of what actually most threatens us, which, you know, we have to be honest, is ecological collapse and certainly nuclear weapon proliferation.
Absolutely. I wanted to move on to a more hopeful note. We were discussing before when I went to Afghanistan, back to Afghanistan as a journalist in 2020 to make a film about they were Afghan troops, but they were run by the CIA, effectively doing the role of special forces, killing, and many civilians were caught up in drone strikes, in raids. But then I also was very privileged during that time to meet a group of very young, very vibrant, hilariously funny um, Afghan peace volunteers, and I kind of lost touch with them after the fall of Afghanistan in 2021. I think I've got that right.
Yes.
But now you've reported to me that some of those people are being relocated to Europe and are involved in some amazing and very relevant projects when we talk about the environment and things like that. Could you just update me and our listeners on that? Because I think among all this, which can be very bleak, there's a note of hope in this story.
Well, you know, Joe, one of the banners that those young people carried, they were so idealistic, said, "Blood doesn't wash away blood."
Mhm.
And right now, as we speak, one of my young friends, Sahel Shayan, who's been able to go to Portugal, he's now studying at the University of Porto. He's trying to work out a blood drive
Mhm.
so that Afghans at the university and in the city of Ledia and in other places in Lisbon, in Portugal, there are now 28 young Afghans who have been resettled in Portugal, mainly through the auspices of permaculture groups. And you know, they've brought a great deal to the culture and to the economy in Portugal because, as you say, they're idealistic and they're energetic and they're bright, but they're also very convinced about war. And so the idea of having a blood drive to donate the blood locally, but to say give blood, don't shed blood,
Mhm.
is it's very intrinsic to what these young people devoted their lives to you know, with considerable risk when they were living in Afghanistan, even before the Taliban takeover. Now, they've been displaced, and often refugees have a stigma which is pretty hard to shed.
Yes.
But I see these young people as emblematic of the idea that newcomers can be welcomed into a society. And particularly if we take the 847 foreign military bases that are used and instead say, don't use these to invade other people's countries, but, you know, to build bridges in order to control and continue, you know, stale and hideous colonial practices. Use those bases as places to welcome newcomers to practice ways of using more renewable energy, of developing new farming methods, of distributing resources. You know, there's so much that can be done to turn around our wrong-headed and our cruel practices that have tried to take over other people's lands and forced people to board dinghies in the middle of the Mediterranean that sink, or to, in order to escape starvation as your livestock are thirsting to death and the waters dry up, of course people have to go on the run. Sometimes the most nonviolent thing you can do is flee, is run. Well, these young people know that, and they had to leave their culture and their homeland and their families. But I see them as really, the way Salman Rushdie put it was that those who flee from wars are the bright, shining shards of civilization. And that's how I see these young people, bright, shining shards. Their lives have been broken in many ways, and they are fun to be with. And they, right now we've got a safe house in Pakistan where 15 of them are crowded in together, and when it gets to be very hot, they're not gonna be very, very comfortable, and when it's very, very cold, they wonder, "How are we gonna keep warm?" But they're getting by, and we're hoping to get visas for all of them to go to to Portugal
Mhm.
soon. And meanwhile, several will enter Germany, I think, just in the next week. There's a couple in, uh, Germany that spent time with the Afghan peace volunteers, and they've been able to get a few people into Germany. By and large, the English-speaking countries that occupied Afghanistan have been utterly stingy
Mhm.
with visas. It's been extremely difficult for anyone to enter the United States, the UK, Australia, or Canada. But there have been a few exceptions, and what does reparation mean?
Mhm.
Of course, people in the United States, and I think in the UK as well, have a big responsibility if our governments won't make reparations for the bloodletting and all of the robbery and theft and cruelty. Well, we personally have to try to repair the situation and pay attention, not look away from people who've been attacked by drones, who've been chased out of their homes, who've been sent to Guantanamo, all of the abuses and the hideous practices of war. It's on our shoulders, and we can do something, and our lives are better for it when we try.
Absolutely. I will say, obviously, been a difficult. If you have an eye on militarism and war, it's been a very difficult few months. Least of all for me, I'm very far away from it, but it's still. But it was it cheered me up, for want of a better phrase, to hear that those young people are making their way in the world and are kind of moving towards safety and doing things they want to do. So it gave me a good feeling when you told me that a few days ago.
Well,
Um,
could I just add, if
yes,
any
of
of your
course.
listeners would like to become tutors to teach them Portuguese,
Yeah.
that's a big need right now.
Yeah, that's a good call. It's a good call
Yeah.
for sure. I wanted to just move on to. I want to, where I can. The idea of this series is to, where we can, pull ideas, resources, values, so that people can access them. Strategy, ways to operate in terms of like how you campaign, how you make your arguments, but also perhaps I want to draw on your the things you've learned, on your learning. Is there anything, when you look back at your time around these movements, particular values which have guided you in terms of how you operate, how you interact, how you build movements? I know that's a very difficult thing to encapsulate, but is there anything that jumps out at you?
Well, I think that when the Occupy movement, your younger listeners might not be so aware of it, but the Occupy movement very quickly created a worldwide understanding of the idea of the 1%.
Mhm.
Like, within months, globally, people got the idea, we are many, they are few. And the idea of the 1% commandeering so much wealth had become a truly global matter, such that people wanted to occupy public spaces and say, this isn't right.
Mhm.
Um, I think we can learn a great deal about how to create alliances wherein you can remain aligned with your own truest beliefs. And for me, that means believing that the poorest in our world should be our number one priority. It means believing that nonviolence can change the world. It means believing that I should never allow inconvenience to get in the way of acting in accord with my deepest beliefs. Okay, I believe all of that, but then I don't want to say, and my group has to be better than your group, or my group has to be in charge.
Mhm.
I think the more that we can emphasize egalitarianism and really practice it such that we share resources and don't at all try to pull rank and say that because people have a certain academic degree, or because, God forbid, because their skin is a certain color,
Mhm.
they or because in their history they've been aligned with certain powerful groups. We have to start setting that aside and say, look, if we want to survive, if we want to prevent ecological collapse, we've got to find ways to link arms together and build increasingly strong and fortified movements, and but not give up our own deepest beliefs. Yeah, I don't think it's a good idea to create so much compromise that you end up subordinating yourself to the values of people that are killers or believe in killing. So there are certain lines I wouldn't cross, but I do believe we have to really try hard to let new groups move forward and listen to the the teachings and the wisdom of some of the people most affected by the militarism in our world today.
Sure. There's something I feel there's something here, and it's something that's come up recently. I think for me in my own activism, the idea of like uh, probably to put it, I could probably put it better, but like living your values, saying the thing and doing the thing. And I think I try and do. We all try and do that, and sometimes we fall down, and sometimes we don't. But it's I don't. Does that kind of reflect your experience? This idea. I'm sure you do a much better job of it than I. Living your commitments. But it's there are challenges inherent to that, aren't there? Um, uh, how do you do that? How do you maintain that commitment across your life and your activism?
Well, I think that a lot of times people allow themselves to be governed by the fears of other people.
Mhm.
And, I've got enough fears of my own to deal with. Everybody feels fear. But there's no need for me to be governed by the fears that other people have uh, when it doesn't align with my own experience. I mean, people have said, "Oh, if you go to prison, uh, your future will be damaged and compromised." Well, in a way, that is incredibly truthful.
Mhm.
If you go to prison as somebody who's already been burdened and deprived in our society. But for somebody who is a peace activist to say, I'm going to stand up to the legal system and speak up. And if it means risking time in prison, that's going to be my opportunity to learn more about the prison system and to better understand the racism inherent in that system. So I'm not going to let that threat of you might go to prison be something that would intimidate me out of doing what I believe is the right thing to do. So I think we have to sort of assess the risks that we face and be willing to admit for those who've already been incredibly privileged in society that we didn't earn these privileges,
Mhm.
and that if at times we risk that privilege, well, it is an opportunity to better understand the situation that most people face in terms of whether or not they have access to health care or whether or not they have access to education or to a secure job.
Sure, and I know you speak from a position of experience. Just for the benefit of our listeners, I know you've had run-ins with the state, with the legal system through your activism on a number of occasions, haven't you? Could you just talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, in 1988, a number of us decided to plant corn on top of nuclear missile silo sites, and that was a very good idea. maybe I wouldn't plant corn now, but anyway, I spent a year in maximum security prison
Wow.
for what I don't think was a crime. I know that at the time the real crime was to build up nuclear arsenals at the height of the Cold War and take people's hard-earned resources and use them to bury nuclear weapons underneath the ground in the breadbasket of the world. That was a crime, but our effort to plant the corn was, I think, a good assertion, and it certainly was a learning experience for me. One of the things that really touched me when I did that action was that, I was handcuffed and kneeling in the grass, and there was a soldier with a gun behind me, and the other soldiers had taken off. I don't know, maybe they had to find out what the manual said to do next. And so I'm a bit garrulous, obviously, and I lasted in silence for maybe a minute and a half, and then I told him why we did what we did and how we hoped it might affect children in his life and also in the Soviet Union. And then I asked him, "Do you think the corn will grow?" And he said, he had a thick Southern accent. He said, "I don't know, ma'am, but I sure hope so." And then I said, "Well, would you like to say a prayer?" "Yes, ma'am." And I said the St. Francis Peace Prayer, which concludes, "Master, grant that I may not seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be pardoned as to pardon, to be loved as to love with all my soul." And he said, "Amen." And then the soldier said, "Ma'am, would you like a drink of water?" And I said, "Oh, yes, please." And then he said, "Ma'am," I'm handcuffed, right? "Would you tip your head back?" So I tipped my head back, and Joe, I can still feel that water dribbling down my chin. This soldier used both hands, I don't know what he did with the gun, to squeeze the water from his canteen down ma'am's throat. He took a risk to do an act of kindness for a complete stranger. And so now I think, what if we could say we care more about giving water to children in Gaza than about maintaining our military arsenals? We care more about water for children in Yemen than we care about being able to dominate that part of the world. We care more about getting water for children in the future as we face ecological collapse. Now, if that soldier's small gesture could be an arrow, a rudder that points us toward sensible behavior,
Mhm.
you know, in the world that we really do inhabit, that would be a great thing. So, yeah, I mean, a year in prison, I often think at the time, I had just finished graduate school. I knew graduate students at the University of Chicago who were a lot more miserable going through, their contortions to try and get a PhD
Mhm.
than I was during that year when I did learn a great deal in prison. But at the same time, one of the things I learned is that the prison system is racist,
Mhm.
and I think it ought to be dismantled brick by brick.
Yeah, it's a very interesting and important uh, to look at the commonalities. I think it's somewhat when we talk about militarism, we talk about it. We've tried to talk about it increasingly in through the lens, if you like, of abolitionism, which also applies to prisons and stuff like that. Do you? I mean, obviously, it's very. Both of these things are very close to your heart. The parallels must be very striking between these two violent, authoritarian systems to you, having been so close to them both for so long.
Well, it does make me feel very, very sad to think that people who had formerly tended crops, worked hard in fields, grew things that people could use to survive, have been corralled into acting like human keepers of other human beings in
Mhm.
this wicked system of taking away every possible freedom from people uh, because they committed something in many cases which didn't really even violate the rights and the potential of other people. They hurt themselves perhaps through the drug trade. So the racism of that system and the ways in which militarists and prisons collaborate, I think, to defy the most basic human rights, uh, the right to live, the right to raise your children, the right to have your basic needs met. Uh, it's so wrongful to keep pouring resources into maintenance of these essentially cruel and wrong-headed systems. Uh, but the profiteering is huge. I mean, every university across the United States graduates a new group of lawyers every year. So how are you going to keep all those lawyers employed? Well, some of them do wonderful things for human rights and to protect the environment. But let's face it, a lot of the legal structure is used to uh, imprison people of color, break families apart, make it almost impossible for people emerging from these systems to be able to get jobs and get decent housing and preserve their family life. So it's wicked and it's wrong.
Mm.
Uh, and there's a lot of profiteering that goes on in our world at the expense of people who meant us no harm.
Absolutely. I've often sensed that it's never fully clarified, but I sense there's a parallel also in that the prison system and war are are often framed as about punishment, and we see that in Gaza, and we see that with Iraq and Afghanistan, that both of these are violently disciplining processes, which are imposed upon people um, by force. And it's as the years have gone by, and I've looked at kind of prison abolitionism and anti-war and anti-militarism, I see this where war is a tool of punishment and discipline. Similarly, there are some parallels there with the prison system as well.
Yeah, and actually, I think gangsterism is what we need to
Hmm.
use our imagination to understand. I mean, Noam Chomsky. When I was a senior in college, I had a chance to go and hear Noam Chomsky speak, and he said the the United States basically says to every other country in the world, if you do not subordinate yourselves to fulfill our national interest, we will eliminate you.
Hmm.
Now, that is a mafia like gangster perspective. And it, I think, encapsulates what the United States has said in its foreign policy decade after decade after decade. You don't believe us? Take a look at Iraq.
Hmm.
And what did we do to Iraq's children? Hundreds of thousands of children died hideous deaths, torturous deaths, brutally, lethally punished by this uh, gangster like force that invaded Iraq and imposed the economic sanctions for 13 years in a state of siege. The United States can then say, you don't believe that we'll eliminate you if you don't cooperate with us? Take a look at Afghanistan. And, they didn't even harbor Osama bin Laden.
Hmm.
Uh, Take a look at what the United States is willing to do to Iran, to any of the countries in this so-called axis of evil. And then you've got Israel as the main ally, and tremendous isolation arising now because of, I think, gangster policies that have benefited primarily the military industrial complex. These big, huge companies that say, you need more weapons? Great, we'll supply them. We supply you the weapons, you give us the money, we create the think tanks and the public relations, and this revolving door goes on and on and on. But I believe it's coming to a point where it's kind of like the emperor has no clothes. There's more and more recognition that this is a diseased and a sick system, and it's going to create much more disease and sickness that we can't afford if we're going to survive ecological collapse.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to close on a difficult question that I've posed to all of our other guests as well, but a very important question. How do we as activists, how do we measure our success? And some of the conversations in previous episodes we've recorded will be very interesting. Some people look at it in more of a metric way. Other people might cite examples like some examples were cited a little bit like your interaction with the soldier there, that is a kind of success. How do you quantify it when you look over your years in the movement? What does success look like for us, for those of us who oppose war and militarism?
I think the question of can we learn to live together without killing one another is crucial for ethical success. But I also think we have to, at the same time as we ask that question, allow ourselves to see the hungriest, the neediest people as the number one priority. Uh, are people's basic human needs being met? I look at China and I marvel at the way in which so quickly so many people were brought out of poverty. I grew up looking at Chinese women as people who were concubines with their feet bound, and now you uh, can have a pretty different perspective on women in China. This isn't to say that the Chinese rulers are nonviolent, but they do seem to be more willing to use diplomacy than the brute force of militarism. And so, uh, can we change people's perspectives so that militarism is not seen as the only tool that we have to solve problems? I think that linked with the question of can we learn to live together without killing one another, and how are the needs of the people who are suffering the most in our world being met? That's how I would measure success.
Absolutely. Kathy Kelly, I could talk for hours, but it's been fantastic and very informative. Certainly one of my favorite episodes that I've recorded out of all 5 seasons. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. A real pleasure and an honor to have you on.
Well, thank you, Joe. I want to also say my thanks to Alex in the background and wish you very, very well. I noticed that behind you, the sign says distorted, but I think that what I've learned from this podcast is anything but distortion. This, I think, has contributed to clarity, and I really am grateful for the chance to be with you.
Thank you so much. This has been Warrior Nation. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. We want to reach as many listeners as possible, so whatever platform you're hearing this on, please pop us a 5-star rating. Apparently, it really helps in terms of spreading the word. You can follow us on Twitter or Instagram on @ForcesWatch. See you next time. If you enjoy what we produce and would like to support us to make more of it, then you can help us keep making Warrior Nation for as little as £2 a month via our Patreon, or you can support us through our donation page. And if you'd like to keep up to date with our work, you can sign up for our free monthly newsletter.